He left his own ship in the middle of the battle. Not because the ship was sinking, not because the battle was lost. He left because 60 Egyptian galleys were breaking through the enemy line ahead of him, their sails already raised, heading south. And the man who had been Rome's greatest soldier for 20 years transferred to a smaller boat and followed them. Behind him, still fighting, still dying, still loyal, his fleet burned. Contemporary records document the scale of what he was walking away from. 500 ships, 70,000 soldiers, 19 legions of Roman veterans who had never surrendered a battlefield in their lives. He had the bigger ships. He had the heavier weapons. He had the most battle-hardened army in the world. And it was sitting on shore, waiting for orders that would never come. 1 week after he left, without a fight, without a command, they simply laid down their weapons and surrendered to the man who had never once led a charge himself. So how did the greatest soldier of his age lose everything? To a man so physically frail that ancient sources record him being carried to his own campaigns on a litter? But here is what historians have never fully resolved. Mark Antony was not defeated on September 2nd, 31 BC. He was defeated in the 6 months before it, in the marshes, in the councils, in the slow disintegration of something that cannot be measured in ship counts or troop strengths. This was a man who had stood beside Julius Caesar in Gaul, who had turned the Roman crowd against Caesar's assassins with nothing but his voice, who had never lost a land battle in his life. Something happened in those Greek marshes that the chronicles record in tactics and logistics, but never fully explain in human terms. The ancient sources hint at it. They do not answer it. You will discover the engineering weapon Agrippa invented that neutralized Antony's greatest advantage before a single ship moved on the day of battle. You will learn the name of the general who handed Antony's complete battle plans to his enemy, making the man who designed the final engagement the only commander on the water fighting blind. And you will understand how the wealth Octavian seized from Egypt in the aftermath collapsed Roman interest rates overnight and funded an artistic golden age that still shapes the world you live in today. To understand why the finest soldier of the Roman world allowed a trap to close completely around him, we need to go back to 44 BC. And the moment Julius Caesar's blood hit the Senate floor and set two men on a collision course that would take 13 years and the future of Western civilization to resolve. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the most powerful man in the world was stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate. Julius Caesar died in the theater of Pompeii, and in the chaos that followed, the Roman world cracked open like a hull struck by a ram, and two men stepped into the fracture. The first moved immediately. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, was Caesar's right hand, his finest general. The man who had stood beside him in Gaul and helped him turn Rome's public opinion against the assassins with an orator's precision. Antony had been trained in Athens in rhetoric and philosophy, and he understood something Caesar had not: that power in Rome was not just a military question. It was a theatrical one. Within days of the assassination, he had secured Caesar's papers, his treasury, and the loyalty of his legions. He stood at the funeral and read Caesar's will aloud to the Roman crowd, a crowd that had loved Caesar the way soldiers love commanders who win, and watched the city turn against the men who had killed him. The second man to step into the fracture was barely 19 years old and had no military reputation whatsoever. Gaius Octavius was studying in the city of Apollonia in Illyria when word came that his great-uncle, who had, to almost everyone's surprise, adopted him as his heir, had been murdered. Ancient sources record that Octavian's health was chronically poor. Suetonius documents that he suffered from recurring illnesses throughout his life, and was sometimes incapacitated during military campaigns. He was not a soldier. He was not an orator in Antony's class. What he was, and what no one around him yet understood, was a political intelligence of a kind Rome had never produced. Patient, cold, and absolutely without sentiment. Both men needed each other. Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, backed by the Republican faction, still held power, still commanded armies, still represented an existential threat to anyone who had stood in Caesar's camp. And so in November of 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and a third man, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, formed what history knows as the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned sharing of power designed to hunt down Caesar's killers and stabilize Rome. 40% of the Roman Senate, according to later records, eventually aligned with one side or the other. The agreement divided the Roman world into spheres of influence that made eventual conflict not just likely, but mathematically certain. Octavian took the west, Antony the east. At the twin battles of Philippi in Macedonia in October of 42 BC, the triumvirate destroyed the Republican opposition. It was Antony, as it almost always was in these years, who delivered the decisive blow, crushing Brutus and Cassius, each of whom took his own life rather than be captured. Octavian, by contrast, played a limited role, his health again reportedly failing him at critical moments. The victory was real and total. And when the three men divided the Roman world afterward, standing in the ruins of the Republic they had just finished off, neither Antony nor anyone else was thinking about the pale young man from Apollonia as a serious rival. That was the first of Antony's fatal mistakes. It would not be the last. By 36 BC, the arithmetic of power had simplified. Octavian stripped the third triumvir, Lepidus, of his military authority after a failed attempt to seize Sicily by force. Lepidus spent the remaining 23 years of his life in comfortable house arrest, stripped of everything except the ceremonial title of Pontifex Maximus. Two men remained, and they had divided the world between them into a split that could only be resolved one way. The question was not whether the final battle would come. The question was which man would understand before it arrived. What kind of battle it actually was. Every measure of conventional power said Octavian should not have survived. He was not a natural military commander. Ancient sources are consistent on this point, and Suetonius records specific instances where illness removed him from active command at critical moments. He did not have Antony's physical presence, his legendary relationship with soldiers, his decades of battlefield authority. He was the adopted heir of a murdered man, which was a political asset and a personal vulnerability simultaneously, and he knew it. What he had instead was something rarer and, as it turned out, more decisive. An absolute clarity about the nature of the war he was actually fighting. The conflict between Antony and Octavian was not primarily a military contest. It was a contest for the definition of Rome itself, for the narrative that would determine which man represented Roman tradition and which man represented its corruption. Octavian understood this with a precision that his advisors, particularly the cultural impresario Gaius Maecena, helped him translate into a systematic campaign of political theater that his opponent never fully countered. The decisive blow was struck in 32 BC, and it was wielded not with a sword, but with a document. In an act that was technically illegal, Octavian seized Antony's last will and testament from the Temple of Vesta, where it was held by the Vestal Virgins, a sacred trust that Roman law held inviolable. Suetonius records that Octavian read it aloud to the Senate, branding Antony a traitor to Rome. The will revealed that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. and that he had made vast bequests to Cleopatra's children. Children Octavian's propaganda had been systematically framing as illegitimate foreign heirs to Roman-controlled territories. The public reaction was, by ancient accounts, volcanic. Here was documentary proof, or what could be made to look like proof, that Antony had transferred his Roman identity to an Egyptian court. The Senate stripped Antony of every legal authority. They declared war. And here is the masterstroke that defines Octavian's political genius. Not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. By framing the conflict as a defensive war against a foreign queen who had bewitched a Roman consul, Octavian avoided the word civil war entirely, forcing Antony into the position of either abandoning Cleopatra or confirming every accusation made against him. According to the War of Actium Wikipedia synthesis of ancient sources, 40% of the Senate sided with Antony anyway and left Rome to join him, which tells us how close the political balance genuinely was. But Octavian had secured the moral high ground, and in the war he was actually fighting. That mattered more than legions. His second great advantage was a man named Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa was born around 63 BC, the same year as Octavian, into a family so obscure that his name, Vipsanius, was virtually unknown in Roman society before he made it famous. Britannica records that he was disliked by the Roman aristocracy throughout his career, his low birth a perpetual social liability in a world where lineage was currency. He did not care. What Appian's Roman history preserves about him is a portrait of a man constitutionally incapable of delay. Octavian had recognized Agrippa's genius early and bound it to himself with a loyalty that went beyond professional calculation. They had studied together in Apollonia, and the friendship forged there proved stronger than any legal or political bond either man would form with anyone else. In 36 BC, when Octavian's naval campaigns against Sextus Pompey had failed repeatedly, he handed total command to Agrippa. Agrippa built a secret harbor on a lake near Naples, trained a fleet from nothing, and destroyed Pompey's navy at the Battle of Naulochus, losing 3 ships while sinking 28. The man who would decide the fate of the Roman Empire at Actium had already proven what he could do when given the tools and the authority to work. Octavian had 2 weapons Antony never fully understood. The first was the will he showed in the Temple of Vesta. The second was the general he had given command of everything that mattered. There is a version of Mark Antony that Octavian's propaganda machine spent years constructing, and the Augustan poets spent centuries cementing. A great man brought low by passion, a Roman soldier unmade by an Egyptian queen, a cautionary tale about what happens when the East corrupts the West. It is a powerful story. It is also, by the assessment of most modern historians, substantially a fabrication. The real Antony was more interesting and more tragic than the propaganda version. Born in 83 BC into a distinguished, if financially troubled family, he came of age during Rome's bloodiest decades and found his purpose in them. Plutarch, whose life of Antony remains the most detailed ancient portrait we have, documents a man of extraordinary personal magnetism, generous to a fault, physically brave to the point of recklessness, possessed of a relationship with his soldiers that bordered on the familial. He drank with them, joked with them, attended their romantic entanglements with what Plutarch describes as genuine delight. He was, by Livius.org's synthesis of the ancient record, one of the best generals of his age, beloved by his men like a god. He had earned that assessment. In Gaul beside Caesar, in the hunting down of Caesar's assassins, at Philippi, where his generalship against Brutus was decisive. Antony had demonstrated a tactical intelligence and a personal courage that placed him among the finest Roman commanders of the first century. He was 52 years old at Actium. He had spent 3 decades winning. His relationship with Cleopatra VII, which began in 41 BC when she arrived at Tarsus on a golden barge to answer his summons, dressed, according to Plutarch, as Venus herself, was genuine, complex, and politically catastrophic. It was not, by any serious modern reading, simply a seduction. Cleopatra was one of the most politically sophisticated rulers of the ancient world. Fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, which her Ptolemaic predecessors had never bothered to learn, in command of vast wealth and a functioning military, and fully aware that her dynasty's survival depended on Roman patronage. Antony, for his part, appears to have loved her in the way men who have survived decades of war sometimes love. Completely and without the usual defenses, the ancient sources record that his officers repeatedly pressured him to send her home before the Actium campaign, arguing that her presence was Octavian's greatest propaganda gift. He refused every time. In 34 BC, at a grand ceremony in Alexandria that the ancient sources call the Donations of Alexandria, Antony distributed Roman-controlled territories among Cleopatra's children, appeared publicly as the god Dionysus Osiris, beside Cleopatra as Isis Aphrodite, and, most fatally, recognized Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as the legitimate heir of the dead dictator. The implications were not subtle. Octavian's entire claim to power rested on being Caesar's sole adopted heir. The donations handed his rival the legal and moral ammunition to declare not just a war, but a cosmic verdict on whose Rome would survive. The Parthian campaign of 36 BC had already weakened Antony's military position significantly. A failed invasion that forced him into strategic dependence on Egyptian resources and damaged his reputation as an invincible commander. And when Octavian stripped the third triumvir Lepidus of his power that same year, leaving only 2 men standing, Antony responded not with consolidation, but with the donations. He gave Octavian everything he needed. This was the finest soldier of his age. He was about to discover that the battle that mattered most would be fought in every place except a battlefield. The Ambracian Gulf sits on the northwestern coast of Greece, like a nearly closed fist. A deep, fjord-like body of water connected to the Ionian Sea by a narrow throat no more than a kilometer wide. The promontory of Actium juts south from the Gulf's entrance, and it was here, in the late months of 32 BC, that Antony positioned his combined fleet and army. He had chosen this location as a fortified staging point from which he could either threaten Italy or receive a decisive naval engagement on favorable terms. The geography had other plans. Modern hydrodynamic research has revealed something the ancient commanders understood only in its consequences. The entrance to the Ambracian Gulf was dangerously shallow. Modern oceanographic analysis of the site indicates that during the 1st century BC, with sea levels approximately 75 centimeters lower than today, the entrance sill measured representative depths of only around 3 meters in places. For Antony's heaviest warships, his __quote_2__ his personal flagship type, with estimated drafts of over 2 meters, this created minimal underkeel clearance. The physics of shallow water resistance are unforgiving. When a large ship's draft approaches the water's depth, wave resistance increases exponentially, and the vessel cannot achieve the speed necessary to make its bronze ram effective. Ancient sources record that Antony's heaviest ships appeared nearly motionless for hours at the Gulf's entrance on the morning of the battle. Modern analysis explains why. They were physically imprisoned by the water they were sitting in. The camp itself was no less treacherous. The promontory of Actium is low-lying marshland, its ground saturated. its air thick in summer, with the insects that breed in stagnant water. Plutarch and Cassius Dio both document what followed from this choice. A severe malaria outbreak that swept through Antony's rowing benches throughout the summer of 31 BC, incapacitating and killing the oarsmen he needed most. The marshes that gave him a defensible position gave his men fever. An army cannot fight a naval battle without healthy rowers, and by high summer, ancient sources record that Antony could man barely half his fleet. Livius.org's synthesis of the ancient record notes something equally significant about the tactical position. Octavian refused to be drawn into battle on land, and he was right to refuse. Antony was by far the better land commander. But the geography of Actium compressed every advantage Antony possessed: his superior ground forces, his heavier ships' ramming power, his ability to project force, into a bottleneck where none of them could function properly. Every week he held this position, his men got sicker. Every week he waited for Octavian to make a mistake on land. His oarsmen died in their benches. He had chosen his fortress. He had not yet understood that his fortress was a cage. The camp sat between the marshy coast and the sea, with Octavian's army 5 miles north on land and the open water not yet controlled, but increasingly dominated. To the west, Antony built a bridge between the two peninsulas, flanking the Gulf's entrance, establishing a secondary camp on the northern promontory. He had a plan. It required a fleet at full strength, healthy crews, secure supply lines, and reliable Allied support. Within months, all 4 conditions would be gone. In the early months of 31 BC, while Antony's forces were still in winter quarters and his commanders were calculating the year's campaign, Agrippa struck. He did not attack the fortress. He went around it. With a fleet of fast Liburnian galleys, Agrippa sailed to the southwestern Peloponnese and seized Methone, the strategically critical port that served as Antony's primary resupply connection to Egypt. World History Encyclopedia's synthesis of the campaign makes the significance clear. Methone was the anchor of Antony's entire supply chain. Without it, the food, fresh water, and replacement crews that Egypt had been sending north through a heavily guarded transport route were cut off. Agrippa did not stop there. He moved north along the Greek coast, taking Leucas, then the important harbor of Petraeus, then Corinth, systematically closing every route by which Antony could resupply from his eastern base. Octavian, meanwhile, had landed his land forces and positioned them 5 miles north of Actium, fortifying his own camp and severing Antony's communications with the interior through skillful use of cavalry. By midsummer, Antony's army of over 100,000 men and his fleet were in a box. The consequences were immediate and cascading. Ancient sources record that disease and desertion gnawed at Antony's camp through those summer months. Appian captures the psychological pressure in his civil wars, describing Antony's legions as wavering, quote, _3, high-ranking officers began slipping away to Octavian's side. Allied kings who had staked their futures on Antony's victory quietly reconsidered their position. Herod of Judea, one of Antony's most powerful eastern clients, switched allegiance during this period. The military position was deteriorating. The political position was collapsing. Then came the intelligence disaster. A general named Quintus Dellius, one of Antony's own commanders, defected to Octavian, carrying with him Antony's complete battle plans. The man who had designed the engagement would fight it while his enemy read his intentions. World History Encyclopedia documents this defection as one of the decisive pre-battle blows. It is difficult to overstate what it meant. Every tactical decision Antony made on September 2nd would be anticipated. Every formation, every flanking attempt, every contingency. Agrippa had read it before the first oar touched the water. Here is where the mathematics of Agrippa's campaign reaches its most stark expression. Antony had arrived at Actium with approximately 500 ships. By the eve of battle, ancient sources record that he was forced to burn approximately 270 of them. Vessels he could no longer man because his oarsmen had been killed by fever or had simply walked away. He would fight the battle that decided the Roman world with fewer than half the ships he had brought to Greece. The genius of Agrippa's strategy was its patience. He did not attempt to assault Antony's fortified position, which would have been costly and uncertain. He starved it. He denied it resupply. He let the marshes do their biological work. He destroyed Antony's fleet strength before the battle through logistics rather than combat. As men of Pompey's analysis of Agrippa notes, his genius was, quote, "4." He engineered the environment and then maneuvered within the system he had built. By the time the two fleets finally faced each other on the open sea, Agrippa had been winning the actual war for 6 months. September 2nd was the invoice. What remained was a council of war, a night of choices, and a morning that would end a world. The night of September 1st, 31 BC, was the last night the Roman Republic existed as even a theoretical possibility. In Antony's camp, his senior commanders gathered to make the decision they had been avoiding for weeks. Ebsco's synthesis of the ancient sources documents what happened. His officers split. The Roman faction, led by his land forces commander Publius Canidius Crassus, argued for abandoning the fleet entirely and retreating by land toward Macedonia, where Antony's strength in ground warfare might reassert itself. Antony was, by every military measure, a superior land commander to Octavian. A land campaign gave him a genuine chance. Cleopatra and her supporters argued for a naval breakout toward Egypt, saving the fleet, the treasury, and the possibility of continuing the war from a stronger strategic position. What Antony chose, and why, is the central historical controversy of Actium. Ebsco's analysis of the competing scholarly interpretations is direct. It seems less likely that Antony wanted a decisive sea battle than that he hoped to break out of the blockade to fight later in a more favorable situation. The evidence lies in a tactical detail that, as Ebsco notes, all ancient records agree upon. Antony kept his masts and sails aboard his ships. In standard Roman naval doctrine, sails were always removed before battle. They added weight, created fire risk, and served no combat function. The only reasons to retain them were pursuit of a defeated enemy, or escape if the battle turned against you. Antony's ships were rigged for departure, not for a fight to the finish. The breakout theory is reinforced by another documented decision. Cleopatra's 60-ship Egyptian squadron, stationed in reserve behind the main battle line, had its treasury aboard. The royal war chest, the financial foundation of any future campaign, traveled with Cleopatra. This was not the positioning of a force planning to stand and destroy an enemy. It was the positioning of a force planning to preserve what mattered most and fight another day. Across the strait, Octavian had received the intelligence his deserters provided. World History Encyclopedia documents that he had been briefed on Antony's breakout plan. Agrippa deployed accordingly, positioning not just for engagement, but for the pursuit of ships at full sail. The trap that Agrippa had spent 6 months building had one last component. He needed to let enough of the battle develop that the breakout would be forced to commit before it could succeed cleanly. He could not stop Antony from leaving. What he could do was ensure that leaving cost everything. Dawn approached over the Ionian Sea. Both fleets moved toward their positions. The question of which man would control the Mediterranean, which culture would define Western civilization, which version of Rome would survive into the centuries ahead. All of it compressed into the next few hours, into a stretch of Greek water, into the decisions of men who had been building toward this moment for 13 years. At dawn on September 2nd, 31 BC, Antony moved his remaining fleet through the narrow straits and into the open sea. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, was calm. The Ionian Sea lay flat under a pale sky, and the two largest fleets the ancient world had assembled faced each other across approximately 1 mile of still water. Antony deployed his remaining fleet. Ancient sources estimate between 230 and 250 ships in 3 divisions outside the straits, facing west. Wikipedia's synthesis of the ancient formation records documents his arrangement with precision. Antony himself commanded the right wing alongside Lucius Gellius Poplicola. Marcus Octavius and Marcus Instius held the center. Gaius Socius commanded the left wing. Behind the main battle line, held in reserve with sails already raised, sat Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian galleys, the treasury fleet, visible to everyone on both sides. Its raised canvas advertising an intention that Antony's opponents had been briefed to expect. Against this formation, Agrippa had positioned Octavian's fleet in a matching crescent, staying carefully in deeper water to the west. Agrippa himself commanded the critical left wing, facing Antony's personal command across the water. Lucius Arruntius held the center. Marcus Lurius commanded the right. The formation was not designed for a traditional engagement. It was designed to deny flanking room and maintain depth water maneuverability, to keep Antony's heavy ships in the shallows where they were slowest, while Agrippa's Liburnians retained their speed advantage in the deeper sea. The asymmetry of the two fleets was absolute. Antony's heaviest ships were essentially floating fortresses. His personal flagship, a Daciarem with 10 banks of oars, towered over anything Octavian had deployed. Wikipedia, drawing on ancient accounts, records that an 8 war galley in Antony's fleet carried around 200 heavy marines. Archers positioned in wooden towers with clear downward firing angles, and at least 6 ballista catapults. These ships could not be boarded from below. They could not be rammed to advantage by smaller vessels. They represented 3 centuries of Hellenistic naval philosophy, the doctrine that bigger meant stronger, that floating fortresses would always defeat mobile cavalry. Agrippa had spent the previous 5 years building a different argument. His Liburnians, light, fast patrol craft repurposed for combat, could not match a quinquereme in direct confrontation. They were not designed to. They were designed to avoid the quinquereme's strengths entirely, to slash its oars from below, to swarm its flanks, to deliver and deploy the weapon Agrippa had built specifically to neutralize towering warships. What they represented was not just a different type of ship. It was a different theory of what naval war was for. For hours after deployment, neither fleet moved. This stalemate was not tactical hesitation. It was physics. Modern hydrodynamic analysis indicates that Antony's heaviest ships, positioned near the shallow Gulf entrance, were physically unable to generate the speed their rams required to be effective in those waters. The ancient sources note they appeared nearly stationary for an extended period. Octavian's fleet, positioned in deeper water, simply waited, comfortable in its element, while Antony's fortresses sat motionless in theirs. Around noon, the regular northwest wind that Mediterranean sailors had known since before Rome existed began to rise. Antony had retained his sails for a reason. The wind was the signal. The patience of 500 ships finally broke. Antony's ships were built to be unsinkable. Agrippa had spent years building something specifically designed to make that irrelevant. The Harpax was an engineering solution to a tactical problem, and Agrippa had developed it with the methodical precision that characterized everything he built. World History Encyclopedia's description of the device is specific. A large ballista-like mechanism mounted aboard ship, capable of launching a wooden spar approximately 7.5 feet long, 5 cubits in Roman measurement, encased entirely in iron bands, with a heavy grappling claw at one end and multiple ropes attached to a ship-mounted winch at the other. The spar was launched from long range. The iron casing was the decisive detail. Earlier grappling devices had always been defeated by enemy sailors with axes, who simply cut the ropes. With the Harpax, the ropes ran through an iron-armored shaft too long for enemy crews to reach. Once the claw embedded in a hull or rigging, and the winch began drawing the rope tight. The two ships were locked together with machine power. Nothing a sailor with an axe could do would change that. The tactical consequence was revolutionary. Antony's quinqueremes, which could not be boarded from standard craft attempting to come alongside, because their towered height gave defenders a firing angle directly down onto attackers, became vulnerable the moment they were immobilized and drawn alongside a grappling ship. The towering fortress became a liability. Its height made it impossible to escape, its marines suddenly fighting upward on the ladders rather than downward from the towers. The weapon that should have been their protection had been neutralized by engineering before the first clash of arms. Agrippa had not designed this device in theory. He had tested it in combat. At the Battle of Naulochus in 36 BC, the engagement that broke Sextus Pompey's naval threat and gave Octavian control of the western Mediterranean, Agrippa deployed the Harpax against Pompey's fleet in a near-perfect demonstration of its capability. World History Encyclopedia documents the result. He destroyed 28 of Pompey's vessels while losing only 3 of his own. The mathematics were not a fluke. They were a proof of concept, confirmed under actual combat conditions against an experienced enemy. Every commander in the Mediterranean knew what had happened at Naulochus. Antony had 5 years to devise a counter. No effective counter existed. At Actium, World History Encyclopedia records that Agrippa's use of the Harpax quickly sank 15 of Antony's ships in the early engagement phase. But the device's most important contribution was not the ships it destroyed. It was what it did to every ship that saw it deployed. A quinquereme captain who watched the ship beside him, dragged alongside a Liburnian, boarded, overwhelmed, and burned by men who had climbed up from below, knew that his own towering hull was not protection. It was a target. Antony had built a fleet of fortresses. Agrippa had built a fleet of wolves. The Harpax was not the only tool Agrippa's Liburnians carried. Wikipedia, drawing on ancient accounts, documents another tactic that negated the quinquereme's power without direct confrontation. Agrippa's faster ships could approach from angles that the heavy galleys could not track and use their speed to smash oars. The long banks of synchronized wood that were a warship's only means of movement. A quinquereme without oars was a very large, very expensive, very flammable platform, with 200 marines on it and nowhere to go. Once isolated from the fleet, unable to move, it could be surrounded, grappled, boarded, or set alight at Agrippa's leisure. He had built the argument in engineering years before he was asked to prove it in blood. At noon, the northwest wind arrived, and with it, Antony's last gamble. World History Encyclopedia's account of the engagement's opening phase documents what happened when the wind came. Antony ordered his right wing to extend outward, attempting to outflank Agrippa's left, the standard tactical opening of ancient naval warfare, an attempt to wrap around the enemy line and attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Agrippa countered immediately, pulling his own left wing further out to match the extension. Both lines stretched, both thinned. The gap that opened in the center as the wings extended was either an accident of tactical pressure or, as the breakout theory holds, exactly what Antony's retained sails had been waiting for. In the left wing engagement, Gaius Sosius launched the initial direct assault. Wikipedia's synthesis of the ancient record preserves a detail that complicates the simple narrative of Octavian's inevitable triumph. Early in the battle, Antony's center under Marcus Octavius and Marcus Insteos briefly defeated Octavian's center under Lucius Orontius, pushing it back, opening the line. Livius.org, drawing on the ancient record, confirms this tactical center victory. Antony's forces were not simply overwhelmed. They were fighting effectively, at least in the initial phase, against an opponent who held every strategic advantage. The battle was not one-sided in its opening hour. But strategic advantage does not stop working because the center line is temporarily broken. Agrippa's Liburnians, operating on the flanks where the ships could actually maneuver, were doing what they had been built to do. Wikipedia documents the mechanics. The light galleys used their speed to approach Antony's heavy ships from ore-vulnerable angles, disabling mobility before engaging, then deploying the Harpax to draw them alongside for boarding. Cassius Dio, in his Roman history, records what followed as the battle intensified. Agrippa's ships using catapults to launch torches at Antony's fleet. The sky above the Ambracian Gulf darkening not with storm clouds, but with smoke. The water beginning to fill with burning timber and drowning men. This was not the clean, decisive engagement of propaganda paintings. It was hours of chaotic, brutal, ship-by-ship attrition. A melee of missile fire from towers, boarding parties fighting hand-to-hand on slanting decks, oars splintering, fire spreading from rigging to hull to the next ship downwind. Antony's Marines were not outfought individually. His heavy infantry, fighting from the towers of Quincarames, were formidable by any measure. What they could not overcome was the tactical architecture Agrippa had spent months building. Isolated, immobilized, unable to support each other, each ship fighting alone while the Liburnians moved freely between them. The professional acknowledgement that the ancient sources force upon us is important here. Antony's men were not fighting badly. His center had broken through. His flanks were holding. The battle that the greatest soldier of his age had designed was, in its opening phase, not the rout that Octavian's later propaganda would describe. What undid it was not inferior fighting. It was the structural collapse of the position behind the fighting line. The sky above the Gulf was filling with smoke. The center gap was widening. And in the rear of Antony's formation, the 60 ships with their raised sails and their treasury aboard began to move. Here is the moment that historians have argued about for 2,000 years. At the height of the battle, when the center line was most extended, when the gap that the wing extensions had opened was at its widest, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian galleys broke from the rear of Antony's formation, passed through the gap, raised their sails to the northwest wind, and turned south for Egypt. They carried the royal treasury. They carried the financial foundation of any future campaign. They carried Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen, who had her own calculations to make about survival, and who had, by all ancient accounts, advised this breakout strategy from the beginning. History.com and World History Encyclopedia agree on the factual sequence. The squadron broke through, found open water, and ran south with the wind. What followed has been debated in every subsequent century. Ancient sources, Octavian sources, shaped by the propaganda apparatus of a man who needed Antony to look like a coward, described what happened next as the most damning act in the history of Roman soldiering. Mark Antony transferred from his massive flagship, which was currently grappled and engaged with Agrippa's ships, to a smaller, faster vessel. He followed Cleopatra. He left his men fighting on the ship behind him. The ancient framing of this as simple cowardice. The great general unmanned by love, deserting his fleet for a woman, was Octavian's version, and it served Octavian's needs perfectly. Modern historians, reviewing the same ancient evidence with different questions, largely read it differently. EBSCO notes that many modern scholars view the transfer as a premeditated strategic withdrawal. Antony saved the treasury, approximately 40 ships, and the theoretical possibility of continuing the war from Egypt. He had, after all, designed the breakout. The retained sails were his plan. Cleopatra's squadron breaking through the gap was the plan executing. What the ancient record does not sanitize is the human cost of the decision. Plutarch, in his Life of Antony, records what happened on those escaping ships. That Antony sat alone in the prow for 3 days, refusing to speak, refusing to look at Cleopatra, staring back at nothing, saying nothing. His attendants reportedly could not get him to eat. The greatest land commander of his age sat in the bow of a small ship, watching the smoke that marked where his fleet had been, and did not move. The chronicles record what he did. They cannot fully explain what he understood. The breakout was not a military success. Antony escaped with 40 ships. Cleopatra escaped with her treasury. But the fleet he had left, the leaderless quinqueremes, the grappled flagships, the marines still fighting on decks their commander had abandoned, had no path forward. Ancient sources record that they backed gradually into the Gulf, their cohesion gone, their command structure gone, their reason to continue fighting gone. By dusk, Octavian was master of the sea. The Battle of Actium was 4 hours old. The Battle of Actium was over. Behind Antony's retreating sails, the greatest fleet the ancient world had assembled fell apart section by section, until only wreckage remained. Cassius Dio, in his Roman history books 50 through 51, the primary ancient account of the engagement's final phase, records the method of destruction with the directness of a man who understood military operations. Agrippa's lighter ships, now freed from the tactical constraints of a contested battle line, used catapults to launch torches at the trapped quinqueremes. The ships that had been impossible to board from below, that had rained missiles downward from wooden towers, that had carried Rome's finest marines into the fight, they burned. Livius.org, drawing on Dio's account, describes the fleet that had terrorized the ancient Mediterranean burning on the water as Agrippa's Liburnians circled, and the northwest wind spread the fire. The human mathematics of the battle's final phase are documented in Plutarch's account, synthesized by EBS-EO. More than 5,000 men killed or drowned. Octavian later claimed to have captured 300 vessels. Historians note this figure likely includes surrendered ships alongside those destroyed, and it should be understood as his self-reported accounting rather than independently verified. What is not in dispute is the totality of the collapse. By dusk, the Antonian fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force. The land army's fate was, in some ways, even more stark. 19 legions. The World History Encyclopedia puts their strength at between 60,000 and 63,000 men, excluding light infantry, plus approximately 12,000 cavalry, had watched the battle from shore. They were not defeated. They were not surrounded. They were not starved or diseased or demoralized in the way the fleet's rowing benches had been. By ancient accounts, they were still capable of fighting. They waited on the shore for their commander to return with orders. He did not return. 1 week later, without a battle, without a siege, without any military compulsion that ancient sources record as decisive, 19 Roman legions laid down their weapons and surrendered to Octavian. Wikipedia and Britannica are consistent on this point. The greatest Roman army in the Eastern Mediterranean simply stopped. The mathematics of what Agrippa had accomplished in the preceding 6 months is visible in this moment. He had not just won a naval engagement. He had destroyed the strategic logic that gave Antony's land forces a reason to fight. And without that logic, 80,000 trained soldiers became 80,000 men waiting for orders from a commander who was already gone. One withdrawal had become 100. 100 had become 80,000. The arithmetic of Actium: 5,000 dead, 300 ships, 19 legions, the treasury of Egypt, the Roman world. Entire. Actium was not the end. It was the sentence. The execution came 11 months later, in the heat of an Egyptian August, in a mausoleum in Alexandria. Antony reached Egypt, understanding the full scope of what had happened. Plutarch's account, preserved across multiple secondary sources, describes the 3 days of silence on the escaping ships as the outward expression of something internal that did not resolve when the ship docked. He attempted to rebuild. He sent word to Lucius Pinarius, his commander in Cyrenaica, to hold the province and its forces, a potential base for resuming the war. Pinarius had already switched his loyalty to Octavian. The Wikipedia account of the war's final phase documents the cascade of defections that followed Actium. Allied kings who had staked their futures on Antony's victory reconsidered with the efficiency of men who had always known which way the wind was turning. Herod of Judea, who had already shifted allegiance during the summer's blockade, confirmed his new position. The network of Eastern client states that had been Antony's strategic base dissolved within months. Octavian moved with the patience that had characterized every phase of his campaign. He spent the winter consolidating his hold on Greece and the East, allowing Antony's position to continue collapsing without requiring military pressure to accelerate it. In the early months of 30 BC, he organized the final invasion, Cornelius Gallus advancing from the west via Perietonium, Octavian himself moving east through Syria toward Pelusium. The ancient sources note, with what the Wikipedia account carefully flags as the quote, _7 construction of ancient speculation, that Pelusium may have fallen to Octavian with suspicious ease. Some accounts implying that Cleopatra, calculating her own survival independent of Antony's, may have facilitated its surrender. Modern historians treat this with appropriate skepticism. The ancient sources themselves hedged. It is preserved here as it was preserved by antiquity, as something that was believed, not as something that was proven. On July 31st, 30 BC, Antony won his last victory. A small cavalry engagement near Alexandria that the ancient sources preserve almost as a footnote. The final flash of the greatest soldier of his age. The following day, his remaining cavalry and fleet surrendered to Octavian without engagement. Then came the false report, documented in Plutarch and in multiple secondary accounts, that Cleopatra had already committed suicide. The man who had never received a false cavalry report without investigating it, who had survived 3 decades of warfare through situational awareness and tactical intelligence, believed it without confirmation. He stabbed himself in the stomach. He did not die immediately. His attendants found him alive and carried him, wounded and bleeding and asking questions, to Cleopatra's mausoleum where she was hiding. History.com and Wikipedia both preserve what Plutarch recorded. He died in her arms urging her to negotiate her own peace with Octavian, having lived long enough to know the report had been wrong. He was 52 years old. He had been Rome's finest soldier. He died because someone told him a lie, and he trusted it. She had outlasted every political threat, every dynastic crisis, every Roman who had tried to use her and discard her. She would not be displayed in Octavian's triumph. Octavian entered Alexandria on August 1st, 30 BC, to essentially no resistance. His agents located Cleopatra before she could burn her treasury. The one outcome Octavian had invested significant effort in preventing, because the Egyptian treasury was the financial prize that would fund everything that followed. History.com documents his intention. He kept her alive specifically to parade her in his triumph. The captured foreign queen whose subjugation would complete the narrative he had been building since 32 BC. He had her guarded. He had her reassured. He allowed her to believe, as Wikipedia records, that she would be treated with dignity. The ancient sources document that Cleopatra made her own calculation. She sent Octavian a gold crown and throne, offering to abdicate in favor of her sons. A negotiating position that had no serious chance of acceptance, but established her as a political actor, making rational moves rather than a defeated woman awaiting her fate. She understood what Octavian needed from her survival, his triumph, and what she gained from her death, its denial. The political logic was clear. On approximately August 12th, 30 BC, 12 days after Antony died, Cleopatra committed suicide. She was approximately 39 years old. The method, despite 2,000 years of AS iconography, is genuinely uncertain. Strabo, a Greek geographer who was alive and writing in the ancient world at the time, records in his work that she died either from the bite of a venomous snake or from applying a poisonous ointment to herself. He does not confirm which. The famous Aspi story derives from later ancient tradition, not from the most contemporary surviving account. Both possibilities are preserved in the historical record. Neither can be definitively excluded. What is not uncertain is the consequence. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded in 305 BC following the death of Alexander the Great, which had ruled Egypt for 275 years, ended. Octavian had Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, intercepted while attempting to flee toward India and executed, the last biological heir of Julius Caesar, whose continued existence represented the one genealogical challenge to Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra's 3 children by Antony were spared, placed in the care of Octavia, Antony's abandoned wife, Octavian's sister, who raised them in Rome. The symmetry was its own kind of political statement. Egypt became a Roman province, not a Senate province, administered through the standard republican mechanisms, but Octavian's personal possession, unique in Roman history. Its grain and gold flowing directly to the man who had just completed the final civil war of the Republic. World History Encyclopedia notes the civilizational significance with precision. Cleopatra was the last active ruler of the Hellenistic world. After her death, only Roman dominion remained. The ancient world that had stretched from Alexander's conquests through 3 centuries of Hellenistic kingdoms was over. A new one was waiting to be named. He returned to Rome in 29 BC. He celebrated for 3 days, and then, with the patience that had characterized every phase of his rise, he spent the next 2 years methodically constructing the appearance of not having done what he had just done. The triple triumph of August 13th, 14th, and 15th, 29 BC, was the largest triumphal celebration in Roman history to that point. 3 consecutive days of procession through Rome, one day each honoring his victories in Dalmatia, at Actium, and in Egypt. Wikipedia documents the spectacle. The treasuries of the East moved through the streets of a city that had endured a century of civil wars, and the effect was immediate and visceral. Ancient records indicate the influx of Egyptian wealth caused Roman interest rates, which had held at 12% through the decades of civil war, to collapse to 4% as Cleopatra's gold flooded Roman financial markets. Historians of the ancient economy note this as one of the most dramatic monetary events of the classical world. The cost of money itself dropped by 2/3 in months, funding the building programs, the veteran settlements, the public works that would define the Augustan age. The military victory funded the cultural one. The poets, Virgil, Horace, and Livy, were already at work under the patronage of Octavian's cultural advisor, Maecenas, reshaping the narrative of Rome's past into a story whose arc bent inevitably toward the man who now held everything. Suetonius records the famous statement attributed to Octavian that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. The physical transformation of the city was real and extraordinary. The Forum of Augustus, the Theater of Marcellus, 100 temples and public spaces rising from the wealth of a conquered world. In 27 BC, Octavian performed the political maneuver that defined his genius most completely. He appeared before the Senate and offered to return all his powers and provinces, to restore the Republic in full. The Senate, understanding exactly what a refusal meant and exactly what acceptance meant, refused. They voted him the title Augustus, quote, 8, a word carrying overtones of sacred authority, and formally granted him command of the most militarily significant provinces. His full title became Imperator Caesar Divi Filius Augustus, Commander Caesar, son of the deified, the revered. He called himself Princeps, first citizen. The Republic technically continued to exist. In practice, it had not existed since September 2nd, 31 BC. The Principate, the system of monarchy disguised as restored republic that Octavian built, was the most successful political deception in Western history. It gave him more power than Caesar had ever claimed while avoiding the word, quote, 9 that had gotten Caesar killed. He ruled for 41 years, long enough, as Livius.org notes, for people to grow accustomed to it. Long enough to forget the violence of the coup. Long enough for the empire to feel like the natural order of things. The mathematics of Actium did not stop at 5,000 dead. They extended forward through 2 centuries of Pax Romana, through the architecture of Roman law, through the Latin language that shaped every European tongue that followed. 1 naval engagement in 4 hours of September morning, and the world that came after. Victors do not only win battles, they build the monuments that teach the next 1,000 years what the battle meant. Octavian understood this with an architect's precision, and he set to work on the physical record of Actium before the bodies of Antony and Cleopatra were cold. On the hill where his camp had stood overlooking the battle site, the same ground where he had watched from a distance while Agrippa won his empire for him, he built the campsite memorial, a tropeion, a formal Roman victory monument dedicated to Neptune, Mars, and Apollo, adorned with 36 bronze rams taken from the largest of Antony's captured ships. Wikipedia confirms the monument's documentation in multiple ancient sources. The rams were not decorative. They were trophies, each one representing a ship of the fleet that had threatened to center the Roman world in Alexandria rather than Rome, mounted in stone where they could be seen by pilgrims who came to understand what the battle had meant. In 29 BC, he founded Nicopolis, Victory City, on the southernmost promontory of Epirus, directly opposite the site of the battle. Livius.org notes the ideological genealogy Octavian was claiming. The name echoed a city founded in the Punjab by Alexander the Great, the benchmark against which all subsequent generals measured their success. He populated Nicopolis by relocating the surrounding towns, establishing it as a real city rather than a ceremonial monument, and instituted the Actium Games, a quadrennial festival elevated to the same sacred status as the Olympic Games. The battle was not to be merely remembered. It was to be annually celebrated, ritually renewed, woven into the fabric of Mediterranean civic life for as long as his empire lasted. In Rome itself, the Temple of Apollo Palatinus, dedicated in 28 BC, built adjacent to Augustus's own house on the Palatine Hill, was the most personal of the Actian monuments. The reference academic document notes its significance. It was the first temple to Apollo within the city's ceremonial boundary, and its construction adjacent to the emperor's residence made an unmistakable theological statement. Apollo was the god of civilization, of reason, of the ordered world. Everything that Octavian's propaganda had contrasted against the Eastern mystery cults and animal gods that his depictions of Antony's Egyptian alliance had associated with barbarism. Captured ship beaks decorated the temple's exterior. Agrippa's victory lived in Apollo's house. The literary monument outlasted them all. Virgil, writing under Augustan patronage, devoted what Livius.org identifies as some of his finest lines. Book 8, lines 676 through 709, to a description of Actium in the Aeneid, framing the battle as a moment of divine destiny, with Augustus as the savior of Roman civilization against barbaric Eastern gods. Modern scholars, including those writing in the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, have noted the constructed nature of Actium's mythological status. That Augustus's cultural program deliberately magnified the battle's significance as part of a broader, legitimizing narrative. The battle was real. The mythology around it was manufactured, and manufactured with extraordinary skill. What survives today is the archaeology of that manufacturing. The ruins of Nicopolis in northwestern Greece. The Roman bronze rams displayed in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The physical record of Agrippa's campsite memorial still visible in the landscape above the Gulf. The story Octavian built in stone has outlasted the stone itself. Modern political scientists studying the mechanics of how republics become empires still assign the Augustan consolidation as a case study. The template Octavian developed: accumulate power while claiming to restore what existed before. Frame rivals as foreign threats rather than domestic opponents. Win the propaganda war before the military one. Construct institutional arrangements that concentrate authority while preserving the forms of shared governance. Has been replicated, adapted, and deployed in every major political consolidation since. The name has changed with each iteration. The architecture has not. This is one of Actium's least visible consequences, but not its least important one. The most immediate consequence was Egypt. UNRV and World History Encyclopedia are consistent. When Egypt became Octavian's personal province rather than a Senate-administered territory, it transferred to a single man's control the most productive agricultural economy in the ancient world, the grain supply that fed Rome's cities, and the financial reserves of a civilization that had accumulated wealth for 3 millennia. Augustus kept Egypt specifically outside the Senate's authority. It was the only major territory administered this way, a fact ancient sources document as deliberate policy. Without the Egyptian grain supply, Rome's urban population could not have been sustained at the scale the Augustan age required. Without the Egyptian treasury, the building program that transformed Rome from brick to marble could not have been financed. Egypt was not just a military prize. It was the engine of the empire that Actium created. The civilizational consequence was larger still, and the reference academic document states it directly. Actium ensured that the Mediterranean would be shaped by Latin legal, linguistic, and administrative traditions rather than the Greek-speaking Hellenistic monarchies of the East. This is not an abstraction. The language of Roman law, which became the legal foundation of every European nation-state, is Latin. The administrative structures through which Christianity spread its first scriptures were Roman. The institutional frameworks that shaped European governance for a millennium after Rome's fall derived from the principate that Actium made possible. The Hellenistic alternative, a Mediterranean centered in Alexandria, organized around Greek-language Ptolemaic traditions, oriented toward the east rather than the west, is the road not taken, and it leads to a different world than the one that exists. Scholars debate, as men of Pompey's analysis of Agrippa notes, whether Actium created the empire or merely confirmed supremacy that Agrippa's logistical campaign had already established. It is a legitimate question. UNRV provides what may be the most honest answer. Without Actium, there would be no Augustan age. Whatever the precise mechanics of causation, the battle was the moment at which every alternative future closed. The centuries of civil war that had consumed the Roman Republic, the conflicts between Sulla and Marius, Caesar and Pompey, Octavian and Antony, ended on the water off Actium's promontory in 4 hours of September morning. The Pax Romana that followed lasted approximately 200 years. 2 centuries during which the architecture and literature and law and infrastructure of the classical world were built and preserved and transmitted forward. Through the Augustan Golden Age, through the consolidation of the empire under Augustus's successors, through the legal and administrative machinery that outlasted Rome itself and shaped the civilizations that replaced it. 200 years purchased at the price of a battle that lasted 4 hours. The mathematics of that exchange are, by any calculation, extraordinary. Actium is one of the most consequential battles in human history. For the first century after it was fought, almost no one who mattered talked about it honestly. This is not an accident. Our primary ancient sources, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Appian, wrote in a Roman world that Actium had created. Plutarch composed his life of Antony roughly a century after the battle. Cassius Dio wrote his Roman history approximately 250 years after the ships engaged. Both men lived under an empire whose founding mythology required Actium to be a divinely sanctioned triumph, rather than a civil war whose outcome was largely determined by malaria, supply line interdiction, and a defecting general with a copy of Antony's battle plans. The accounts they produced are detailed, dramatic, and filtered through the legitimizing requirements of the world they inhabited. UNRV and Ebexo are both clear on this point. The ancient record is the only record we have, and it was written by men whose professional world depended on the empire that Actium made possible. The most underappreciated figure in that record is the man who actually won. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who conceived and executed the logistical campaign that destroyed Antony's strategic position before the battle, who invented the Harpax and proved it at Naulochus, who positioned every ship on September 2nd and commanded the decisive left wing, is remembered as Augustus's general. Britannica notes the social dynamics that shaped this invisibility. Agrippa scrupulously maintained a subordinate public role throughout his career, understanding that the Principate's fragile fiction required Augustus to be first among equals and Agrippa to be the indispensable servant. Men of Pompey's analysis of Agrippa captures the architectural significance of this self-effacement. His restraint was not just personal loyalty, it was structural. By standing as the indispensable subordinate who never reached for the top position, Agrippa made monarchy palatable without naming it. His own writings, an autobiography, and geographical works that later writers reference, are lost entirely. Britannica confirms their loss. The man who built the original Pantheon and won the battle that created Western civilization is a footnote in the history of his own achievement. He died in 12 BC. Augustus mourned him for over a month, longer, ancient sources suggest, than he mourned almost anyone else in his long life. UNRV and Wikipedia both record that Augustus personally supervised the education of Agrippa's children. The man who had never needed recognition appears to have been genuinely irreplaceable to the man who had needed him most. The central historical question, whether Antony fought to win at Actium or fought to break out, remains unresolved. EBSCO presents both interpretations with scrupulous fairness. The same ancient evidence, read through different assumptions about Antony's intentions, supports opposite conclusions. What modern scholarship has largely settled is the character question that Octavian's propaganda answered differently. The portrait of Antony as a great man, unmade by passion. The easy story that Virgil and Horace and 2,000 years of Western culture found so useful, has been substantially complicated by more careful readings of the ancient sources. UNRV's assessment reflects the current scholarly tendency. Antony was defeated by a combination of medical catastrophe, intelligence failure, strategic encirclement, and an opponent who fought on terrain, political warfare, propaganda, institutional manipulation, where Antony had no defenses. He was not destroyed by love. He was destroyed by a man who understood what kind of war they were actually fighting. 2,000 years of scholarship keep returning to September 2nd, 31 BC. Not because the ships are interesting, because the humans are. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, began on calm water and ended in smoke. 5,000 men died. 300 ships surrendered or burned. 19 legions, the finest Roman army in the Eastern world, laid down their weapons 1 week later without a fight. The treasury of the most ancient civilization on earth passed into the hands of a 32-year-old Roman who had never personally won a battle in his life. And the ancient world, with its Hellenistic kingdoms and its Ptolemaic dynasties, and its 3-century dream of a Mediterranean centered in Alexandria, ended. Mark Antony had been the greatest soldier of his age. He died in August of 30 BC, in a locked room in Alexandria, mortally wounded by his own hand, carried in by attendants who had found him alive on the floor and brought him to the one place he asked to go. Plutarch records that he died in Cleopatra's arms, urging her to negotiate her survival with the man who had destroyed them both. He was 52 years old. He had spent his life winning. He lost once, and it cost everything. Cleopatra died 12 days later, denying Octavian the triumph he had kept her alive to provide. Strabo, a contemporary witness, tells us she died by snake or poison. The Aspi story is famous, but the certainty is not. What is certain is that the choice was hers. The last act of the last Ptolemaic queen was a refusal. Marcus Agrippa outlived them all, and outlived the moment that made him. He built Rome's aqueducts and its sewers and its pantheon. He managed the empire's administration. He married Augustus's daughter and became, in everything but name, the second most powerful man in the world he had built. He died in 12 BC, still the indispensable servant still refusing the honors that Augustus repeatedly tried to press on him. Augustus mourned him for over a month. The greatest unsung general in Western history died as he had lived, with credit flowing in every direction except toward himself. What Actium built has lasted longer than the ships that fought it. The Pax Romana, the Roman legal tradition, the Latin administrative language that shaped every European nation-state, the institutional architecture that outlasted Rome by 1,000 years and more. All of it traces back to 4 hours on a stretch of Greek water in September of 31 BC. The battle was not the largest ever fought. It was not the most technically sophisticated or the most evenly matched. What it was, by any accounting, was decisive. In the specific sense that the word deserves to have. It decided things. It decided the shape of the world. The ruins of Nicopolis still stand on the promontory of Epirus, above the water where Antony's fleet burned. The entrance to the Ambracian Gulf is still narrow, still shallow in the places that mattered. The northwest wind still rises around noon in September, just as it did when Antony's sails caught it and carried him away from everything he had built. On September 2nd, 31 BC, on a stretch of blue-gray water off the coast of Greece, the ancient world ended and the modern one began. Not in a single decisive stroke, history never works that cleanly, but in the slow collapse of one vision of what the Mediterranean could be, and the patient construction of another. Two men who had spent 13 years building toward this moment finally met on the water. One left, one stayed. And the world that came after belonged to the one who understood from the very beginning that the battle worth winning was never the one fought with ships.